Taking the Tradition On has come out of this Arts Council England project, which is a project that I have been doing all of this year, mostly about Duncan Williamson and about Scottish traveller culture. And taking the Tradition On was a chance to really look back at my apprenticeship with my mentor, who was Duncan Williamson, and for me to learn about that. But taking the Tradition On is looking at that tradition, but other traditions and just storytelling in general, and what the tradition of storytelling is, where it comes from and where we're heading with it, and just a space to really explore that. So most of my guests are storytellers, but not all. And I have a very, very fabulous, very exciting guest this evening, as I'm sure you all know. It is the wonderful and marvellous Shonaleigh, who has absolutely nothing to do with the Scottish traveller tradition, apart from the fact that she did come and get drunk with Duncan with me a couple of times. So, Shonaleigh, we have known each other for a ridiculous amount of time. So we were, with Simon, kind of the only young storytellers on the storytelling scene, on a very, very kind of new and exciting storytelling scene. So a lot of people don't like the word revival and storytelling revival. How can you revive something that isn't dead, is what Duncan always used to say. But in the 80s and 90s, it definitely changed, and it became a new storytelling scene started to arrive that was more public, maybe more accessible, that popped up in lots of different places and art centres. And obviously Ben Haggerty was doing his stuff in London. It started happening much more on the folk scene, rather than just being maybe around that comfortable vision that people have of a, you know, grandmother to grandson and sitting around the kitchen table, and that cosy but very insular storytelling scene that if you're not already part of it, you can't discover it. And so that's where we met, being the only people under 50 on that scene. And we managed to be up and coming for about 20 years.
I think we did, yes. Yeah, I think from our 20s to probably our late teens, early 20s to at least our 40s.
I think we can safely say we probably both kind of up and come now.
Definitely, we've come and gone out the other side, really, I think.
And it's great because there is a whole kind of new, loads and loads of fantastic young storytellers coming in, which is just completely brilliant. But we will giggle and we will probably tease each other quite a lot. And it's quite interesting to interview you as somebody that I know really well. But there are things that we don't maybe talk about as often and as deeply as we would like to, though we have had many, many kind of evenings sort of talking to 3 o'clock in the morning about all sorts of rabbit holes and storytelling. So for people who don't know you at all, you are a Druts'yla. And I'm not sure that everybody will know what a Druts'yla is.
Okay, so you want me to tell them, perhaps?
I would love you to tell everybody what a Druts'yla is.
I would love to do that. First of all, could I just share a memory that I have of Duncan? Because I thought that would be a nice way to start it off.
Yes.
And it was when I was... do you remember when we did Sidmouth and Duncan and Packy Byrne were there, and I was very, very pregnant with Isaac? And yes. When Isaac was about 3, Duncan went up to him and he said, "I knew you when you were in your mummy's tummy." And Isaac's eyes got huge, and when we walked away, I mean, he already thought Duncan had magical powers anyway, and he just leant over and he said, "Mummy, how does he know it was me?" So I just wanted to share that because I just thought that that was just so typical and just wonderful of like that whole relationship. So yeah,
what is a very lovely man, and your son is a very special, well, he's a very special child, and he's now a very special young man.
He is, yes. He's hopping around upstairs with a broken leg at the moment, but that's another story for another time. What's a Druts'yla? Well, I'm going to probably drag the prof over to kind of explain the pronunciation in a minute, but basically a Druts'yla is a Yiddish oral storyteller. but it has its roots in the lowlands, in the Netherlands mainly. And so it is a real mix of Ashkenazi and Sephardi stories, because the Netherlands is one of those few places with where Jewry, you got Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jewry moving through, living side by side, where normally you would get the Ashkenazi Jews in the north and the Sephardi Jews in the south, and never the twain would meet. But in the Netherlands, that wasn't the case. And so Druts'yla's it was a very specific to that region. It was passed on from grandmother to granddaughter. You started learning at the age of 4, and you learnt this very kinesthetic way of holding story in your body, of knowing how to unravel narrative and look at story and hold it so that you could reassemble it to tell fairly quickly. So that was one of the things that would happen. And then secondly, you would learn this vast lexicon's the wrong word, because lexicon means books, doesn't it? What's the English word? Vast repertoire of these huge cycles of stories as well. So you'd be doing the two things. And the Druts'yla tended to work for a community and would be not only just the storyteller, but would be there for things like weddings, deaths, births, marriages, high holy days, rites of passage, that there's certain sort of ritual things that they would do at certain times. And it was very much a role that was held in the community. So that's pretty much what a Druts'yla was. And the stories, some are what we would call indirect teaching stories, some are just very entertaining. And there's a vast range from sort of folk tale through wonder tale right up to sort of myth and what we would call the Mishnah and the Tanakh, the sacred sort of stories as well. But it's very hard because the word is my pronunciation, so you'd struggle to find the actual word. It comes from Druts'yla, which is the German or the Yiddish for a storyteller, which could be male or female. And the only reason we realised my pronunciation is because I swore in Flemish when I was in Belgium, and of course the prof went and did all the, oh, well, that means that, and that. I can't actually, if you need to ask him that question later, ask him, because he's the brains of that particular operation. Does that make any sense?
Yes, it does. And so you are the only one that you have managed to find that still holds some of this tradition, aren't you?
Pretty much, yeah. We always put a question mark after it because I can't say for definite. And I think because it was very specialised in a small part of the lowlands, and was also very common. It was as common as the mugs we're drinking out of, that we wouldn't think were precious things to save. It was a woman's tradition, so it was all oral. It was never written down. And then you had sort of two big things happen. You had the First World War, where you got this huge movement of people and communities, and the mechanization and sort of the splitting up of communities and people travelling, and people going to England and all over to escape from the First World War. And then, of course, the final blow was the Second World War, where your chances of survival, if you were a sort of an elderly Jewish woman, were, well, especially if you were from the Netherlands, was pretty much zero. So it went from being very, very common, so common you wouldn't even think about it, to within 5 years to the brink of extinction, really. And I find people that in their 90s that will go, oh, I remember hearing a Druts'yla when I was a child. And that generation is dying. I will find people that will go, I think my grandmother might have been a Druts'yla or might have heard a Druts'yla, because some of the stories you're telling I recognise, even though they're not written down anywhere. So there are echoes of it, but we've never actually found somebody that has the whole, well, the repertoire and the training and everything together. We're still looking. And again, Simon says if we find another Druts'yla, it'll be absolutely wonderful for 3 weeks. And then we'll start to argue about which is the right way to do it. But
3 weeks, huh?
3 weeks is good. But that's kind of where it is at the moment. We're looking. We're in touch with YIVO, the Yiddish Institute, and we're talking to different people. But for example, if you go to the Israeli folklore archives, of the thousands, and they have thousands of folk tales, because Dovnoi, the famous Dovnoi, that the Yiddish and Israeli folklorists would sit uh, at the port of Haifa as the refugees were coming in from all over Europe, taking down folk tales, and people said he was nuts. Why do we want this stuff from the old world? People wanted to get rid of it, and if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have the Israeli Folklore Institute. But actually, in all of those thousands of stories that they've collected, they've only got 2 Dutch ones, because most Dutch people didn't get out. So I think that's probably why we're still looking. And it was just a fluke. My Bubbe was a Druts'yla. My Bubbe survived the Shoah, the Holocaust. My Bubbe was living with us when I was born. And for whatever reason, she just poured it all into me. I got the bag of sweets, if you like. Nothing special about me. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time.
Well, that could be a whole other argument, I think. There's one thing. You have choices at 4 that you may not have a choice at 4, but you do have choices at 14 and 24 and 34 and 44. So so you started then when you were 4?
Yeah. I didn't realise I was learning. I thought I was playing a lot of the time. I thought I was playing games, But looking back, I was being thrashed. I was going through this process, which was a series of games and language and story.
So what country were you in when you were learning?
For the first 7 years of my life, I was in Oldenzaal, which is the Netherlands, and Enschede, near the German border. And then from 7 onwards, I was in the UK. My mum moved to the UK, and I was in the UK. So my shift went from Dutch and Yiddish to English, because as a 7-year-old, I didn't want to speak with a Yiddish accent. I got teased, which is why I've got such a mongrel accent now. I've got bits of this and bits of that. Didn't want to speak in a Yiddish accent because I got teased. Went to a school in London and wanted to speak English. So my mother, very well-meaning, but did the worst thing she could do. She sent me for elocution lessons. So I got teased even more. So I then ended up with a Mockney accent. It's just like, then there was just no hope at all.
So, but were you still learning the stories in Yiddish?
A lot of them, yes. But then I did the thing, I don't want to speak Yiddish anymore. I don't want to speak this. And you get really rebellious when you're about 8. You want to speak English because all your friends are speaking English. So I would learn, but I still struggle sometimes because I can't find an English word for an image that I'm trying to describe. But a lot of the learning that I have is you're learning, and you know this because we've worked together, you're learning by a set of pictures, you're learning by imagery more than by sentences and language. So that became less vital. So yes, I started out in Yiddish and Dutch, and I ended up in English, learning them in English.
And how long did your grandmother stay with you? How long did you keep learning until?
Till I was about 19, and then she had a heart attack and graduated, as we say, quite suddenly. So yes, from the age of 4 to the age of 19. By the age of 14, I'd learned most of the cycles. 15 and 16, 17, you're telling, you're locking them in there. And I would have still been studying with her probably into my 20s if she hadn't have graduated. So
But
yeah.
though you'd also sort of left home at that point as well, hadn't you?
Yeah, I had left home, and I'd gone to for my pains, I'd gone to drama school.
Well, this was something I wanted to talk with you about as well, really, because I mean, obviously, if you had been, I mean, because she was obviously in a new country and in a whole new, not just a new country, but a new world. I mean, like, things had moved on so much, things changed so much after the Second
Mm.
World War. So you were telling the stories when you were 15 and 16, but was that just to her, or was that, I mean, were you part of a Jewish community there? Were you getting to be a Druts'yla in the community? Did
Not
she get to be a Druts'yla in a community in this country?
Not so much. Basically, and again, it's a hard question to answer, really. But by the time I was 16, I was quite disgusted at the way Orthodox Jewry treated women, and I really struggled with that. I really, really struggled with that. And I was very, very upset the way my mum and my Bubbe were treated. So I kind of stomped off. So I was telling to Jewish friends, I was telling to my Bubbe and my family and my close community, if you like. But I wasn't kind of standing up in a shul and telling like I do now. I work with my different communities. I work with the Manchester shul, I work with shuls all over and Jewish communities. But when I was 16, I wasn't doing that. I was quite angry, I think, at the way women were treated, and I didn't like that. And yes, certain things would come up about my Bubba survived. She survived the camps, and I hate to say it, but if you were a male survivor, you were praised. If you were a women survivor, they wondered what you did to survive, and that was a hard pill to swallow. So I think I was very, very angry in my teens. I've mellowed a lot now. I've mellowed so much. So yeah, so I was telling, I suppose, at home and to like a very close knit community, but I wasn't out in the shuls telling the way I'm now, really. And so that, I suppose, the
Maybe
outlet.
ask Simon to stop with making a peanut butter sandwich. I don't know if that is what he's doing, but it sounds
I
like it.
will ask him, Simon, could you stop making a peanut butter sandwich or whatever you're doing?
I am not making a peanut butter sandwich.
What are you doing?
I am feeding your mother-in-law.
Ah,
Oh, right, okay.
okay. It's apparently
Sorry, I
feeding
didn't
my
realise it
mother.
Probably needs to be
Yes.
done then. Fair enough.
I'm done,
Welcome,
I finished.
welcome to our world.
Welcome to our world.
Where was I? What was I whittering on about? So yeah, I think I got very angry and sort of stomped off. And I suppose the thing that kept me to my Jewry, if you like, was the stories, the culture and the stories, because I can't say that from the age of about 16 to 24, I really wasn't a practicing Jew at all. I kind of went off and got very angry. And then I kind of came back because I had Isaac, and all of those things kind of bring you back to sort of think about your community and where you are and what you want to give back to your community. But by that time, I'd also like gone to drama school. I'd done a few.
Well, that was, yeah. I mean, so with drama school, was that kind of partly inspired by all of the storytelling that you'd done, or was it an escape from storytelling, or?
If I'm really honest, it was an escape from storytelling. I think I'd had so much of it, and I wanted to see. I'm very dyslexic, so I was kicked out of school because I was thick. I'm not thick, I just think differently. So I think for me it was an escape to see if I wanted to do something else. And so I went to drama school. And what I usually say to people, I'm quite honest, I say, Bubbe taught me how to tell stories. Bubbe taught me stories. But when I'm doing like the big festivals, in America, and I'm working on a stage, Bubbe didn't teach me that. Bubbe didn't teach me how to find a light or how to project my voice or work on a stage without kippering my hands. I learned that at drama school.
Yeah, there was the Guildhall. Victoria's actually asking which one. So
yeah, Guildhall, GSA and Guildhall, yeah.
Because I did wonder that if that was something that had helped and enhanced your storytelling, or if it had sort of got in the way a little bit.
I think at some point, had I learnt the acting first, it would have got in the way. But I didn't. I had a real grounding in story before I learnt certain performance skills, if you like. So I don't think it got in the way. I think if I'd have done it the other way around, it would have really got in the way, because you've got to kind of clear through all that to get to the tikkun, the heart of a story. But no, it helped me find a light. It helped me work a room. It helped me to do those things that, when you... You know what it's like when you first start storytelling and you're there in the local shopping centre, and they put you next to the escalator and they want you to do go and be entertaining, will you? And you're there going, oh Lord, in a bucket. And so it helped me project and kind of be a bit more overt, because I
don't think you've ever had much problem being overt, to be fair.
I thank you for that, because I think that's a compliment, Amy.
Yes. Mostly.
Oh, well played. So yeah, I think it actually helped, because at the beginning, in jury, it's called a begente. Begente is like a cabaret teller, what you would probably call a performance storyteller. So it helped me when I was being a begente. So yeah, I think.
And then you did quite well to find the storytelling scene, really. I mean, they were kind of qualified, and certainly your mum was determined that you were going to be a proper actress.
Oh yes. Yes,
And,
she'd got a box already bought at sort of the Globe or wherever,
I'm not entirely sure she was terribly impressed at me dragging you off to Fate Festival.
No, she hated you for a while. I think it was
dragging you down.
Well, it was actually by accident. I'd come up to Sheffield. I'd followed a man up to Sheffield because of the climbing. So I was up in Sheffield climbing, and I bumped into this real reprobate at a pub called the Grapes one day, And this particular reprobate, I remember him telling a story called, was it The Devil on the Motorbike or something? Was it The Devil on the Motorbike?
No, it was a version of a Duncan story.
It was a version of a Duncan story. So Duncan's to blame again, you see.
It wasn't Jack and the Devil's Purse.
It was something like that.
It was the Minister and the Devil.
Minister and the Devil, yeah. Duncan version of that. And I just thought, oh, what is this? And they said, oh, it's storytelling. And I thought, it's not like any storytelling I've ever heard. And then he took me to Much Wenlock, where I met you. And we used to go, was it the Wenlock Inn, and tell stories.
Well, I think it was the second young or the third festival at the Edge that we met. So it was very, very early days of storytelling.
It was about the second or third festival. And I remember, because you were at university in Leeds, and we would all pile in the car and drive for like hours just to go to Wenlock Storytelling, pile back in the car and drive hours back up the A38 and stop at that really awful little greasy cafe and have beans on toast.
We were the only people that weren't lorry drivers.
Yeah, at 3 a.m, and we used to do that a lot, and so that was kind of how I discovered the storytelling scene, if you like. And I remember sort of saying to you and Simon, oh, this is amazing, people are doing storytelling outside of a shul, I love it, it's incredible, and then just schlepped around to every festival I could find, or you dragged me to, really. So it was great, including Whitby Folk Festival.
Yes, we draw a veil over that. We were having a little bit of a reminiscence about Whitby before, which probably shouldn't go out to the public.
It should never go out to the public, ever.
But in those days, I think you did see the storytelling scene as a very different thing to everything that you had learned with your Bubbe. And you just the two kind of never met. They were just like parallel lines, and they never crossed.
Yeah. What I did at home, I never saw, I never kind of meshed them together or saw them as the same animal for a long time. And I think what I did when I started telling, I was very much a Bacente. I would go through the cycles, I would go through the stories, and I would pick out the ones that I would think were hilarious or funny, because I'd also done quite a bit of stand-up by then as well. So I would cherry pick stories out of the big cycles and do them as standalone kind of stories on the stage, almost very comically, because I didn't think that people would be interested in these huge cycles that I tell, I really didn't think they would be at all interested, because some of them go on for days, and bear in mind, very young, very naive, and I would look at stories and think, oh well, people only want things that are like 15 to 20 minutes long, maybe 90 minutes on a good
The scene
day.
was very different then. I mean, and now I think people are quite used to there being lots of storytelling clubs where the format does seem to be kind of, we do two 45-minute halves, and a storyteller should have a piece that is two 45-minute halves, and that absolutely was not the case. It was much more kind of, you usually have like several storytellers in a concert, and you'd all have like 10-15 minutes.
Yeah.
And because I was having the same thing really with some of the Duncan stories, because I would go to his and we would have evenings of storytelling, and we'd have these hour-long, 2-hour jack tales, and there was nowhere to do that.
No.
There just wasn't a space. So
Yeah.
I think we could have spent some car journeys more profitably now I look back.
Well, maybe, but they were very good car journeys. But you're right, the scene was very different. Sort of 25 years ago. God, it's nearly 30 years actually, isn't it? The scene was very, very different. So yeah, I behented my way through my first sort of quite a few years. And then a weird thing kind of happened in my head, which is like I was suddenly aware, and you've probably had this, of people sitting in the front row taking notes, and going, oh, how did you pronounce that? Was that Ashmody? How did you pronounce that? No, was that Lilithi? What's that woman's? And I would go, well, why do you want it? And they'd say things like, oh, well, I'm doing a school tomorrow and I really want to tell this story. And I had never encountered that before. I was horrified. So I then went from, I don't want to tell these stories because I don't think they want to hear them, to, I'm not going to tell these stories because you don't understand these stories and the way they sit, So then I still didn't tell them for a long time, and I suppose it was 2009 when I actually kind of made the decision that if I didn't do something, everything was going to die with me, really. Actually, I didn't make the decision. Isaac and Simon made the decision for me. They kind of used emotional blackmail.
I wonder who they learned that from.
I was about to say, I wonder where they got that from, yeah. Yeah, Isaac kind of came out with the fact that, so if you cark it tomorrow, Mum, cark it is I don't know, it's a Yorkshire expression. It means if you die suddenly. If you cark it tomorrow, Mum, everything's going to be gone. You need to do something. And then Simon, kind of followed on right with the emotional blackmail, sort of by saying, so when you die and you meet your grandmother, your Bubbe up there, you're going to say, sorry, an entire tradition died with me. I couldn't be bothered to save it. And that was the thing that kind of really made me think, oh my goodness, I'd never really thought of it like that. So yeah.
So how are you passing it on?
Careful.
Apart from, you know, nagging Isaac to providing a suitable grandchild.
Yes, well, that well, I'm actually passing them on to Isaac at the moment, who has no desire to tell at all at the moment. But somebody asked him recently, well, why do you want to learn the stories? And he said, well, I'm not learning them for me, I'm learning them for my 40-year-old self. Because when I'm 40, I will probably want to tell them. And if I don't learn them now, it'll be too late. So 23-year-old Isaac doesn't want to learn them, but 40-year-old Isaac will kick my butt if I don't. So that was his reasoning for learning them. So I'm passing them on to him. But I also, I take 14 students a year on, and I teach them the drash techniques, which they can apply to their own work, their own stories, their own cultures, just this way of unpeeling and looking at narrative. But then I also have a bunch of people that I'm passing the stories on. I'm teaching them the stories and all of the little labyrinths that the stories go down. And they're sort of Wildwood students and mentors and people that work with me to support the tradition. And they're amazing, absolutely incredible people. And so that might not have been how it would have technically have been done in the old days. But if I wait for a if I wait for a granddaughter, you know, it will be too late. There'd only be just one other Druts'yla, and there needs to be lots of people that know these stories. Otherwise, you know, they're going to go. So it's not exactly how it would have been done. But a very wise person, you know, Del Reed. Del Reed once said to me that tradition is something that happens when people come together, and what they take away, that becomes tradition. And I think he was right with that, you know. And so we're creating a new way of passing this traditional material on. It wouldn't have been the way my Bubbe would have done it, but it's the way that it works so that the material will survive, the techniques will survive, and things will change, you know. But most of it will survive, I think.
Do you think that grown-ups are capable of learning stories in the way that a 4-year-old is? Do you think somebody can learn the whole of the tradition that you hold when they're an adult?
Well, that's a great question. I think probably to learn the entire 12 cycles the way I did would be almost impossible, because that's a huge amount of material to just learn by, you know. But the world has changed. Simon is recording everything. And my belief, and from what I've seen and the people I work with, is if you can drash, the drash is the technique by which you unpeel and look at these stories, and it's all held in your body. And that's what I teach on my courses. If you can drash, and if you learn one story, like the ruby tree or the emerald sea, if you can drash and you learn one story so you know how those two things apply, then you've got the formula. And the rest of the stuff is recorded. You don't need to remember it. It's there in the recordings. So all my mentors have access to the entire archive, you know. And so so as long as you can drash and you've done one story, so you've learned how you apply that, it's a very robust movable technique. You can apply it to any of the stuff in the catalogue, and you don't have to worry about holding the whole catalogue in your head, because it's already there, it's already recorded. So I think it's possible, you know. I do think it's possible. I'm hopeful.
When you say the whole catalogue is recorded, it's not yet, is it? How
No,
far
actually,
through
that
are
was
you?
a blatant lie. That was there are 12 cycles. In each cycle, there is approximately, it wavers from cycle to cycle, but there is an average of 8 sub-cycles in each cycle. So, for example, in the cycle of Manasseh, there is the sub-cycles of the ruby tree, the Diamond Girl, the Opal Forest, the Emerald Sea, the Sapphire Staff, Tobias and the Snow Tear, Cloth of Hope and Sorrow, and the 10 Wonderful Things. So you've got those, and that is a complete cycle, and we've finished recording that about 12 months ago. So we've got one cycle completely and utterly recorded. We're just starting on the next cycle, which is the cycle of Patient Hillel, and that starts with the Song of Lilith, Eve's 3 beautiful daughters, the Petal Demon, the Glass Palace of the Moon Maid, the Bridge of Pearls, and the rest elude me right now. And so it's taking us about 18 months to 2 years to get a cycle in the can, as it were. So it's a life's work, really. It's another sort of at least 15 years before we'll probably get everything, the entire thing recorded. But when you're working with traditions, as you know, you're not thinking short term. You're thinking, where's this going to be in 20 years' time? Where's this going to be in 50 years' time? Where's this going to be in 100 years' time? Is it going to be still in existence? I have to make sure that I've preserved this, or at least done my job as entrusting that these stories are passed down for the next generation. So, you know, 15 years sounds like a long time, but in traditional terms, it's the blink of an eye, really.
Well, and we were talking that it was 25 years ago, really, that we met, and we're sort of really starting on this path. I mean, obviously, you'd started quite a lot before that, but we were going out and actually telling to people at the beginning.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we both agreed of, and that was the great thing, is that we were looking at a career where you would be venerated as an old woman instead of thrown on the trash heap. And there seemed to be very few jobs where older women were kind of what's the word? Not quite venerated.
Valued. They were valued.
Yeah, valued.
Respected. You know, I always remember you telling that story as I think you created it, or it might have been one of Duncan's, about the old woman in the caravan weaving the cloths and mending the clothes that people brought to her, and that had a really big impact on me, because I just thought, yes, that's exactly what you're saying. It's about doing something where actually the longer you do it, the older that you walk this path, the more knowledge, the wiser you become, the more you understand how story works, and you are, you know, you're not thrown on the scrap heap.
and it takes a lifetime to do, I think, as well. I mean, that was the other thing, is that we were starting off as young people and seeing a lot of people coming to it older, and think, well, yeah, that's great, but actually, I think it's going to take me my whole life to get somewhere with it, really.
Oh, definitely, yeah. And
Kaz has heard it. How lovely. Kaz is doing the song.
Sorry?
From that story.
Oh, right, yes.
And Victoria's saying, you know, when you get to a later cycle, how will you be sure you remember earlier ones?
Oh, it's very hard to explain. The drash is a technique that allows you, and it's an incredibly embedded technique, it's a very physical technique that allows you to embed a story and absolutely reduce a story into one image. And then that one image is stored. I hate using the word memory palace, that's such a Western thing. That one image is stored in a sanctuary. You're taught to build a sanctuary. So I'm doing this. Front brain, back brain, sanctuary, Bubbe would say. So you store that image in your sanctuary, in whatever room you want to store it in. Sai has a bit of film, actually. It's the weirdest bit of film in the world. And when you are trying to pull these stories up from your memory, all you have to do is remember that one image, and the whole thing opens up and starts to play out, and you just tell what you see. And it's very, very simple. It's actually the easiest thing in the world. So I'm telling these stories now that I haven't really told for a long, long time. I've not told the Song of Lilith since I was about 14. 15 and I'm celebrating my 49th birthday today. You don't look it, I hear you say.
Absolutely. You don't look it. But the thing is,
Spot
you
on.
don't look it, but you sound it. You exude decades of wisdom in the body of a youthful child, Shonaleigh.
Oh, lorks. But so what happens is these things are stored in your sanctuary. So as you get to them, they're very easy to remember. You just pull up that image and the whole thing just lays itself out like a map, like a whole video in front of you, and you just tell what you see. And actually, the whole concept of the drash is that it embeds a story in your physical body like a memory through every sense. And so you're reliving a memory. And obviously, you're not going to use exactly the same words as you might have used 15 years ago, but the images, it goes back to what we were saying at the beginning about what language did you learn this in. The images are still the same. The images are incredibly powerful things. So, for example, I was telling a story of the warrior that has a tongue of iron, an eye of stone, and I couldn't think of the right word, and I said an arm of brass. And I cannot explain, but most storytellers that are listening will understand when I say the word felt wrong on my tongue when I said brass. It just felt wrong. I can't explain it. I knew it was the wrong word, but I didn't have a better word. And I was struggling with it, and we do these things called Tellers, Tales and Tradition, and we've done some for you, Amy, and they're great, and they're very interactive. And somebody once said, Sai actually, said, well, what's the picture that you've got that goes with that image of that arm? And I explained this picture that I had, and somebody else that was listening said, that's not how you make brass, that's how you make bronze. And as soon as he said that, and I said he has a tongue of iron, an eye of stone, and an arm of bronze, it was like a ruby. It just went, and I thought, yes, that's totally the right word. That's the right image. So it's a combination of so many things.
I'm just going to stop you there because you say, oh, yes, well, it's just easy because it all rolls out and you just describe, say what you say. In the nicest possible way, and I don't mean to be mean to any up and coming storytellers, there are lots of people who have a story in their head and who describe it, and it's as exciting as watching paint dry. There are some stories, I have to say, as long as people actually have their heart in there, then that is usually enough to carry me. But having the images in your head and being able to speak them aloud and carry your listeners with you are not the same thing. And you do there's lots of skills that you have just very dismissively listed as being easy you have spent years learning. And I also think as a Western thing, it's very difficult for a lot of people to have enough trust in themselves and the story to start a story without being able to see where the end is, and to only be able to see that little bit ahead of you. And it's kind of, I mean, I've got a few stories like that, and it's where I kind of panic because when I start it, I don't know where I'm going to end up. And I know that I can do it because I've done it before. But it is a little bit like if you're playing battleships, kind of like, you press the little square and suddenly like a little bit, the sea opens up and you can kind of see that bit, and it's just a little bit is revealed at a time. And I think you have to have quite a lot of confidence in your training and your story to be able to start on that path, and an awful lot of skill to be able to describe what you see as you go along.
I think you've kind of nailed it to a certain extent. I think one of the things is you have to trust the story. One of the things that Bubbe used to say to me is you must know everything you tell, but you don't have to tell everything you know. I think that was the first bit of really good advice. And the other bit of really good advice is I did a story once. Is it all right to swear? It's a very short sweary word.
Yeah, anybody who's going to be offended, just stick your fingers in your ears or put her on mute for 2 minutes.
Just imagine this little Yiddish old lady. I did this story with all the arrogance of a sort of a 14-year-old, and she just went, "That's lovely, dear. Now do it again, but not shit." because I had been telling this story like I was doing it a favour, and I didn't believe it. And you have to believe a story when you tell it, and it has to inhabit you, and you have to care about it. I hate it when you hear people going, "Oh, this is," and they're throwing the story away. It's like a vehicle for them to be clever. And actually, if you're entrusted with a story to tell, that story is trusting you, and you must trust the story very, very, very deeply. And one of the things that I have found in a Western society that that I hadn't really encountered before is that to be a storyteller, people think it's about picking up a book, learning a story, and telling a story. But actually, in a tradition, as Duncan would have told, that is the last thing that you do. You get to know that story. You work with that story. Any of you that are craftsmen, you wouldn't expect to pick up a piece of wood and just make a cabinet. You would learn about the nature of wood before you did it. You wouldn't expect to pick up a piece of gold and silver and just make an exquisite piece of jewelry without learning about the nature of the material that you're using. And as a storyteller, we have done this, spent a long time learning about the very nature of the material that was then going to be our livelihood, that we were going to work with. And I think that helps an awful lot as well, because I don't tell a story I don't care deeply about. And when I'm telling them, they're like friends to me. I want you to care about them. I want you to travel with me. I have a sincere desire for you to really walk that story with me. And another thing my Bubbe used to say was, don't feel self-conscious, dear. Less of the self, more of the conscious. So she was full of these they used to call her Blunt Joe, because she really didn't mess about, she used to just tell it how it was.
So I've got two burning questions now. We could go sort of one of two ways, but I think I have to ask, following on from that, you've been given these 12 cycles with these, and each one with the 8 enormous stories within it.
Yeah.
And some of those stories are very old.
Yeah.
And obviously things have changed drastically over that time. And there are definitely some stories, and with my work at Duncan, there are stories that Duncan told and he would have told with love, and that I now do not think are appropriate to tell anymore, because I did, less so with Duncan, because I think he didn't keep all of those stories. He was already kind of, I think he was a bit ahead of his time in fairness and equality and various things. And people talk about there being no stories about disability, and there are lots and lots in Duncan's repertoire. And he doesn't tell the story about disability that I hate, and just actually I don't think I could bear to tell, which is sort of Lusmore, that thing about kind of a hunchback being given an extra hunchback, being given a hunch as a punishment. I mean, I just think is something that in now would be a very difficult thing to tell. 100 years ago would have been hilarious. In all of those cycles of stories, I mean, there is that thing, you've got to have a connection with the story, you've got to love it. If you're given those cycles, well, these are the stories and this is how it goes, what happens when you kind of hit one of a crucial story in there and you hate it? Or, did that happen to you? And what do you do about it?
I think there's two things there. There's two answers to that, okay? The first one is, when we tell stories, we think of ourselves as standing up and telling the story, and then we walk off and the story is done and we have presented the story. There's no room for discussion. But in my tradition, the stories were there to talk about what couldn't be talked about. So the things, people say storytelling will change the world, and Bubbe would say, no, it won't. If storytelling was going to change the world, it would have happened already. It's been around for thousands of years. But what storytelling will do, if it's done right, is create a space where those difficult conversations can be had, and that will change the world. And often, like I told a story the other night, and I will be telling a story further down the line, where you're dealing with maybe some unpalatable things. maybe misogyny, rape, things like that. But the thing is, I would never present that as a story that could never be argued about. And I think when you tell a story and somebody says, well, actually, I really hate that, and you can say, well, why do you really hate that? And they can say, because, and you end up having a discussion. And if you censor all your stories so they're all pretty and lovely, then those discussions never, ever take place. That's one thing. But I do have a story which is a version of that one. It's a Dutch one. It's called Gempiebakket Jan, which is Humpback Jan. And I looked at that for a long time and I thought, what is the tikkun? What is the heartbeat of that story? And it is about something that is perceived as ugly, that is then given as a punishment, and things that are moved over. I wanted to tell the story, but like you, I didn't want to use the humpback, so I made it a big spot on the end of the guy's nose. And then we had lots of discussions about acne and various other things. But I think you have to use your integrity and make those decisions. But I also think you need to sometimes tell the stories that people are going to go, well, I really hated that. And you can go, well, why? And then you can have those discussions. Again, another thing Bubbe used to say, she used to say the difference between a performer and a storyteller is a storyteller is prepared to tell the stories that people don't want to hear. You know, so that you can have those really good discussions where you can take the story and say, I think the king was a bastard. I think that was completely uncalled for. I mean, for goodness sake, King Solomon is not wise. The man is an idiot. He's a fool. He never learns. He's a prize misogynist. He's an idiot. But we still tell those stories, but we tell them, and what you would, if you were working in what we call Rosh Hashanah, the women's groups at the new moon, you would tell these stories, fall about laughing, and discuss how foolish men can be. And it would be, those stories would be told to young women, so look out for that in a man and look out for that. And they would be not told as these beautiful missives to be presented as this lovely mythical perfection. They would be learning stories, you know, because you could challenge the storyteller. I think that's the thing about a Druts'yla. You can challenge a Druts'yla. You can, you know, I always remember the first time Simon and I told in a synagogue. Well, I was telling with Si in a synagogue, and Si did a riddle, and nobody could get it. And so he gave them the answer, and they all argued with him. He was like, this doesn't happen. And I went, it kind of does in Jewish culture. They'll argue with you and they'll challenge you and they'll discuss, because that's what we do as a people. You know, 12 Jews, it's 36 opinions. You know, we'll discuss, we'll talk, we'll analyse, we'll come to a conclusion. We won't accept a story as we cannot change. This is perfection. We can listen to a story and go, that really sucks. What's happening in that story is disgusting. Why is it disgusting? Let's talk about that with our young people. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I think most storytellers have a load of stories that they know that they wouldn't tell as performers in performance. Yeah. And certainly I do. I mean, I kind of I have soul stories that are ones that are personal for me, and I kind of use in different situations, or I identify with at certain points in my life, that I might tell to one close friend over a cup of tea. There are definitely ones when you go, I think you need to hear this story, or the stories that I want my children to hear, that I will make sure that they know that they have in their kind of their armory, that I wouldn't tell other places. And I think I'm learning from you and learning from the stories, that I'm trying to have more places where you can discuss. And I mean, that was one of the things that I got as well from Duncan, is that, you know, kind of absolutely nothing is sacred, really, you know, kind of
we must discuss it.
That, you know, a story is to take you to a different place, and by discussing it you kind of stay there and you have those conversations and you talk. But it is that interesting thing of, you know, and I've definitely had battles with stories where I think, well, this story needs to be told, but I hate it, and I'm
Yeah,
whether
yeah, I've had
I'm
that
not
too.
sure. And that whole thing of, can I tell a story if I'm not telling it true, if I'm not being there? But sometimes telling a story from anger is as powerful a place as telling it from love. You know, kind of, I think you have to have a passionate relationship with the story.
Yeah, you have to. It has to dwell inside you in some way. If you tell it dispassionately, you might just as well recite the telephone directory, really. But you know, it just come to mind a story where a worm challenges God. You know, there's a story where a worm actually goes up and challenges God and goes, "You got it wrong. You lied." You know, and God's there going, "I did," and all the seraphim and the angels are going, "Actually, you did, mate. Yeah." You know, so there are stories like that. So if a worm can challenge God, we can challenge the stories, you know.
Oh, do you know, it is 9 o'clock, and there's so many questions that I still want to ask you, which we'll have to save for another time. I mean, particularly, I really wanted to talk to you about landscape and story,
Oh,
because
yeah, we didn't do that.
I know, and I think that is quite a long conversation because our traditions are so different.
Yep.
And who's going, please, can we have part two? Is it being 9 o'clock? Well, I think, yes, we might have to have. I think we might have to have part two. I think there is plenty more to talk about. I did promise that I would get people up at the end to talk about the Q&A. So I'm going to have a little bit of time now to sort of let people up for Q&A. So the questions are, I'm going to give you a little bit of warning. I'm about to put you on to, you know, you're allowed to talk. Some people come a little bit late and then they're very surprised when I let them talk at the end. So Susie Doncaster, Judy Pickering and Seth Townsend, you are the people that I'm going to, if I can find you. Finding you is always right. Seth, you're already permitted. Where's Judy?
Seth, you are permitted.
Yes, are permitted. And says Judy. Right, Susie Doncaster. I think you. I can't find you, Susie. You've vanished. You've vanished, Susie.
She's bored. She's gone home.
I feel that's very unlikely. Right. So I'm going to get Seth to talk because that is really follows on from what we've been talking at the moment. So Seth, if you allow yourself, I've let you talk. You might have to press the unmute button if you would like to discuss your question.
Yes. Oh, hello, Shonaleigh.
Hello, lovely Seth.
Oh, lovely. Lovely to hear all those wise words. And my question was about the Jewish way of disagreeing with a story and the unpalatable stories, which you might have said enough about. But as one Jew to another Jew, I understand the way that, no, that's not how the story goes. You know, you have three different people coming in there. But my real interest is I sort of speak to you with certain understanding that I wonder if non-Jewish audiences pick up on, and if you ever have problems and you find yourself having to explain what to us would be, well, in Torah, look at the Torah, all the stories are terrible, all the heroes are horrible people, but can you hear me? But
yeah, I can hear you.
do you have issues with non-Jewish audiences who don't quite get where you're coming from? Do you have to find yourself explaining?
Rarely, but yes, I've been in a situation. Sometimes I've had to explain certain things. Sometimes I've had to explain words or customs or different things. I tell you what has happened to me before. I was doing the ruby tree, and somebody said, "Well, I don't understand why that's a Jewish story," because the symbolism was so deep that you would have understood that what we were dealing with, it was Halakh law, but it was so buried that you would only know if you were Jewish. So
Yes.
in all, you know, like putting a wall around a tree, so we know that that is owned by someone, about, you know, the sacred nature of stones and all this. And they were like, oh, I don't see why that story is particularly Jewish.
Yeah.
And it screams to me, and you don't have to explain it to a Jewish audience. But I've never had anything too negative that I've had to really explain. I think sometimes I've had to explain mikvah. I've had to explain that in a story because there's a story, you probably know it, you know, where the Sarah and the matriarchs turn up and sweep Judith into the mikvah with them, you know, and that's a beautiful story. And I've had women go,
I don't know what a mikveh is. I'm sorry, non-Jewish person.
a mikveh is a ritual bath that a woman would usually have when her period was over. And if you look at certain Torah, it's so that she's cleansed and can go back to her husband. But actually, if you look at it in the Druts'yla stories, and also I think, sorry, Seth, going to go off at a tangent as well.
Yep.
When we're looking at some of these stories, the lot of the stories that are written down have been written down by men.
Yes,
If you look
exactly.
at of the Druts'yla version, it's actually quite different. So when they go for the mikvah, it's not so they can be clean to go back to their husband. It's to give them space to be women away from that kind of oppressive patriarchy. There's another thing, you know, Lilith. If you look at Torah, Lilith is thrown out of the Garden of Eden
Yes.
because she dares to contradict Adam and she wants to sleep on top. But in the Druts'yla version of it that I learned as a child, well, I was about 12 when I learned it, is the creator looks down and says, who can survive outside of paradise best, Adam or Lilith? And chooses Lilith's strength and guides her out. And just those words, it's the same action but by different words, very different context, isn't it? Instead of being thrown out, she is chosen because she is stronger. She can survive outside of paradise. And then Lilith weeps by the waters and turns a sea so salty that nothing can live in it. It is dead. And that's a very different connotation. So I probably haven't had as much negative stuff as you have, but the thing that really gets me is I have got one story where, you know, the guy goes to Elijah and says, I've slept with this woman, I'm unclean, I'm a terrible person. And Elijah goes, oh, don't worry, she's a demon, you're all right. Which is demonizing women, you know, totally. But I do tell it, and then we have that discussion about that has happened to women throughout time. So actually, what is quite a negative story becomes quite positive when you end up having those discussions. I don't know.
It was the particular thing I was interested in because I tell those stories, and there has to be discussion, and there has to be, well, why have these been told like this? And what's the next bit that hasn't been told? You know, in Torah, I mean, it starts with the life of Sarah. It says, Chaye Sarah. And it starts, and Sarah died. You know, so there's a story there that's been taken away.
Yeah,
so,
and I must tell you the story. I have the story.
I tell you what, you know, when we were saying we really want to have part 2, maybe we invite Seth back for part 2 as well.
Oh yeah, we can.
Because now I've got the two of you together, I know if I don't butt in, we will be here till midnight, which I would kind of quite like. But
Thank you, Seth. Brilliant question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Seth. And I'm serious about sort of getting you both back together. I think a Seth and Shonaleigh special would be fantastic. Judy Pickering said, therefore the story becomes a vehicle which opens up the conversation. Yes, absolutely. And I think we've kind of, that's a statement we've kind of covered that. Susie, I think the going back to Bubbe and the games and techniques that Shonaleigh did with Isaac when he was little, without necessarily the tradition, but as a way of playing, I'm guessing that the answer is probably yes.
Yes, absolutely. Isaac's been Druts'yla all his life. He just didn't realise it.
And may talk about more about that in part 2 as well. But I am going to kind of bring this to a close for now because there is so much to talk about, but it's just been a fabulous evening. But it is your birthday and I want to make sure we end at a suitable time for you to go and drink more Prosecco.
You're very
I think that's really important.
I have Prosecco and chips.
However, there is already sort of a part 2 arranged, because tonight has been talking about the tradition, taking the tradition on, and we've been referring to stories, giving bones of stories, but we haven't been telling stories. And so Shonaleigh is going to be my guest on at Ballast, Beautiful Lives and Startling Truths, this Friday. So if you haven't already got a ticket, then if you go to Eventbrite and just put in Shonaleigh and Blast, you will easily find the page on Eventbrite to buy a ticket. So the tickets are £5.80. And look, there we go. My little sprite of loveliness, Abby Simmons, has put up the link straight away.
She's amazing, that Abby Simmons.
She is very fantastic. Who also runs a very, very fabulous club, Strange Times Online Storytelling Club, and we're having a bit of a get together this Friday. Yes, strange times. You were all invited to Blast this Friday. We didn't want to compete against each other, so it's a bit of a joint mission. And it is the story of First Dog. And I know lots of you have encountered First Dog. If you've heard Shonaleigh storytelling, First Dog sort of wanders in and out of lots of those stories from the gem cycles that Shonaleigh was mentioning. And
do any of you remember Gregory's Girl? Well, I mean, I'm going back some, but if you look at the film of Gregory's Girl, a penguin just wanders around, just occasionally. That's First Dog, really. Kind of wanders through stories and then out, you know.
A bit like the squirrel in Ice Age.
Yeah, like the squirrel in Ice Age. So we're going to be doing First Dog stories from the beginning to the end,
which is just going to be absolutely fantastic. So come to that. That's this Friday. You will need to buy a ticket, preferably in advance, because also we might be getting up to the 100 limit. So if we're getting close to that, I need to decide whether to extend the room or just keep it nice and close, because 100 is kind of a nice amount so that we can have discussion and talk and comment on the stories as well.
Yeah.
So a few other things to mention. The other thing is, obviously I've got this lovely sign behind me for Get a Word in Edgeways. So Get a Word in Edgeways, the actual festival will be happening next year, second weekend in July, but we're doing a series of online concerts, monthly online concerts, which is second Thursday, which is this Thursday. So we've got a fantastic concert coming up this Thursday with Kathy Wallace and Jean Atkin, Kate Innes and Joseph Sobol. So that's going to be a really fabulous concert. And that is the last in this little series of Get a Word in Edgeways, Get a Word in online concerts. But we are going to be having a new autumn series from September to December. So there won't be Get a Word in Edgeways concert in August. Taking the tradition on, in the terms of discussion, I've got two specials coming up. So next week is going to be with the wonderful, wonderful, wonderful Doc Rowe. And exactly. Doc
amazing Rowe, man.
I'm going to try and describe briefly, but basically, he got really annoyed with the BBC in the 1950s because they said that traditions were dying out and it was only the BBC basically that was holding them together. And he went, that's not true. I can see loads going on. And he picked up a camera in his teens and started taking photographs. And he's just carried that on all of his life. So he's been, and as technology improves, he's just got the latest technology. So he has videos, he has photographs, and he's documented the last sort of 70 years, really. I mean, that makes him sound older than he is, but he did start very young, so maybe 60 years.
About 60 years, yeah.
Yeah, and we could, I mean, I think there might be several Doc Rowe specials, but next week we're going to be focusing on Scottish Travellers because he does have archive footage of Duncan Williamson, of Sheila Stewart, of Stanley Robertson, of Willie McPhee, of Betsy White. And I've asked a few people whether we should make next week a little bit longer. And people were kind of saying, well, maybe an hour is enough. I don't know, but there will be lots of voices. So I think we probably will do what we've done tonight. We will have an hour with Doc Rowe till 9, but then have questions afterwards. So we'll kind of go on a little bit after 9 with your questions, but we will do till 9. Yes, Shonaleigh, you got your hand up.
I've just remembered, could we all raise a glass talking about travellers? I share a birthday with the very lovely and no longer with us Sheila Stewart, and it would have been Sheila Stewart's birthday today, so I'd just like to raise a glass to Sheila Stewart and the Stewarts of Glengowrie and all her wonderful
absolutely to the very, very wonderful Sheila Stewart, who may, as you would say, have graduated, but is still very much in our hearts and very much in the tradition, and very much her songs and her stories
Very
are.
much so.
She is one of the people that when I tell her stories, she is a very loud voice in my head. And
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
you may want to have your own take on a story. There's very limited, what's the word? There's limited sort of ways off the path with a Sheila Stewart story, because she will shout at you while you're telling it if you do.
Fabulous woman. Fabulous woman. The only woman who ever made me eat pork. But that's another story for another time.
Well, Seth and Shonaleigh. Now, the other thing that last week I had Joseph Sable on, and we were talking about Jack Tales. And at the end of last week, we kind of came to the conclusion that we need to have a Jack Tale Kaylee. We need to tell some of these Jack Tales. So in 2 weeks' time, 2 weeks tonight, that's what I'm going to do, is I'm going to have a Jack Tale Kaylee. So the marvellous Heather Yule is here listening tonight, and she's going to be one of my guests. Joseph Sobol is going to come back, and Mike Rust. So 3 of my recent guests who've all got particular interest in Jack Tales. And it is going to be 2 hours with a break in the middle, because Jack Tales need a bit of telling. To get a decent Jack Tale in, you need about 20 minutes really. So we're all going to tell one Jack story, and we're going to have a lot of chat and discussion and talk about Jack. And because I'm in the conversation, Jack's mother's going to play quite a big part. And Mike's partly been invited with all the comments that he was saying last time about what about Jack's daughter. I don't know very much about Jack's daughter. She's not a character in the stories that I know. So that's what we're going to be doing in 2 weeks' time. And we're also going to be having a poll, I think, next week as to whether you want to have taking the tradition on over the summer. So my Arts Council bid is coming to an end. I need some time to write everything up. My work with Duncan's material and the tapes is going to be going on for the rest of my life, but actually the specific terms of the bid are coming to the end, and taking the tradition on has been part of that. So I will be asking you next week if you want me to keep going and what you want to see, and if we should take August off and maybe start September, or if you've all had enough and think that you'll be going back to real life. So well, I've been having a very marvellous time. I love doing it. So half real life. Well, well, maybe not quite real life, but slightly more outside life. Well, thank you for everybody saying more. We'll have a chat. So I shall devise a proper poll, because there's this little polling thing down the bottom that I've never played with. So I'll put that up next time. So thank you, Shonaleigh, for sharing your birthday with us, and for helping me to take the tradition on, and for just sharing the jewels that you have, this fantastic and wonderful tradition that we've all got so many more questions about. And I'm just really looking forward to welcoming you back here on Friday to hear stories of First Dog. So everybody else is also just saying clapping and clapping, and thank you for sharing your birthday. Have a lovely rest of the evening, and just lots and lots of love and warmth coming to you. So if you've all sent lovely messages to Shonaleigh, she hasn't had a chance to read them yet, but don't worry, I'm just saving the chat right now, and I'm going to send it to her so that she can have all those lovely birthday messages and things, and read them all with a glass of Prosecco. So,
thank you.
Good night, everybody. Thank you all for helping me take the tradition on, and hopefully see you next week with Doc Rowe.